welcome to the deep dive.
Good to be here.
So today we're really jumping into something quite specific, but really vibrant, contemporary Scottish political theater.
Yeah, that's right. Looking particularly at the Thatcher era and the years following, it's a period that, well, often gets overlooked.
Right, kind of pushed to the side, isn't it?
Yeah.
Seen as just sort of peripheral to the main Anglo-centric theater world.
Exactly. But what we want to do today is really move beyond just reading the plays themselves, the text.
Okay.
We need to look at the whole picture, the actual productions, the staging, how the audience reacted, the whole context, really.
The theatrical qualities you mentioned, the immediate stuff.
Precisely. Those things that are specific and immediate to that time and place. We've got material looking at the political background, the funding issues, which are fascinating, actually.
Oh, yeah.
And case studies. Companies like Wildcat, 7.84 Scotland, of course, and a much more recent group, Bloodwater Theatre, who pose a really interesting challenge theoretically.
Okay, that sounds like quite a journey. So let's unpack that right away. Thinking about the 1980s specifically, what was the driving mission behind Scottish theater then? And maybe crucially, how did all those external pressures, political, financial, how did they actually shape what happened on stage?
Well, you absolutely have to understand the context first, the backdrop. And the starting point, really, is this widening gap, almost a chasm, you could say, opening up between Scottish civil society and the British state.
Especially under Thatcher.
Especially under Thatcher, yes. It was a time of, well, increasing friction, real dissent.
And Scotland wasn't starting from, a blank slate. It had its own distinct institutions already, which must have played a role.
Oh, absolutely. For centuries, Scotland had maintained separate national institutions. Religion, the legal system, education, they were quite distinct.
So even though politically part of the UK,
culturally, there was a very strong sense of difference, a separate history, separate structures. Even the media landscape was different, separate newspapers, dedicated TV and radio services, even if some content was networked from London.
Right.
And all this sustained a kind of subjective nationalism. Scots saw themselves as a distinct nation, often, frankly, defining themselves against Englishness.
And a big part of that self-image, wasn't it, was this idea of the egalitarian myth, that Scotland was somehow fundamentally more equal than England.
Yes, that was a very, very powerful narrative, this belief that Scottish society was inherently more egalitarian. Now, sociologists like David Macron pointed out that the reality was maybe more complex.
How so?
Well, it was perhaps more about an ideal of equality of opportunity rather than actual equality of achievement. It wasn't, truly classless. But the feeling was there that the gap between rich and poor wasn't as stark as down south. And this perception was really core to the cultural identity.
So when Thatcherism came along, with its focus on, competition, individualism, deregulation,
it felt like a direct assault, an attack on that core belief, on Scotland's sort of collective soul, if you like.
And it wasn't just an ideological clash, was it? The government actively targeted Scottish local governance, those labor councils.
Exactly. Thatcherite legislation seemed designed, really, to undermine these often quite powerful and usually labor-controlled local authorities that provided so many essential services.
Like what specifically?
Well, in the mid-'80s, you had attempts to restrict councils from issuing publicity that was deemed political. That was a direct response, actually, to some very effective campaigns run by councils like Lothian Region.
Right.
And then probably the biggest hit for local services was compulsory competitive tendering, CCT, which came in 1988.
CCT. Sounds quite technical, but what did it actually do?
Its impact was huge. It forced councils to put loads of their own services, things like bin collection, school meals, you name it, out to tender, so private companies could bid for them.
Market forces.
Precisely. It massively reduced the ability of councils to provide services directly and, crucially, consistently. It was ideological, forcing local government into this market-driven model. And you combine that with things like the right to buy for council tenants.
Selling off council houses.
Yeah, which fundamentally chipped away at the whole idea of widely available, affordable rented housing provided locally. All these measures were pushing councils towards that Thatcherite vision. Small state, market knows best.
And at the same time, mass unemployment was becoming, well, almost accepted. Justified, even.
Tolerated, certainly, and often framed as necessary pain, making industries slimmer and thinner. But there's also a clever or maybe cynical shift in blame.
How do you mean?
Well, the government pushed these narratives about the black economy, about people fiddling their Social Security.
Right, blaming the unemployed themselves.
Exactly. It neatly shifted responsibility for the economic hardship away from government policy and onto the individuals who were suffering. But, and this is crucial, the people affected didn't buy it. They felt attacked first by losing their jobs and then by having their character questioned. It just deepened that sense of political alienation.
Okay, so this constant pressure, structural, ideological, even sort of moral pressure,
Yeah.
it starts to crack the established political culture in Scotland.
It fractured it, absolutely. And that's where you see these alternative emergent discourses starting to bubble up.
Because people felt ignored.
Utterly ignored. The fact that the Scottish majority view, often represented by Labour MPs, could just be consistently overridden by Westminster, that was deeply galling. It really changed how people saw their relationship with the British state. Loyalty began to fray.
And you see voters shifting, even middle-class voters moving away from the Tories.
Yes. And the SNP, the Scottish National Party, really gained traction. They cleverly shifted their platform more to the left.
And crucially, identified with things like the anti-poll tax campaign.
Hugely important. The poll tax was universally hated in Scotland, and the SNP's strong opposition gave them massive credibility and visibility. But the biggest shift, maybe, was that constitutional change devolution, independence suddenly became a mainstream issue.
The Scottish Constitutional Convention, for example.
Exactly. Even though the Tories ignored it, its existence was a massive political and cultural moment. And interestingly, this is where Scottish culture itself gets reevaluated. Things that might have been dismissed as, parochial or folksy.
Tartan and shortbread stuff.
Sort of, yeah. But now, that distinctively Scottish culture, especially working class culture, found a new resonance. It connected with that growing political dissatisfaction, this focus on an authentic, living folk culture that became a real driving force for the political theater we're looking at.
Okay, that political context is vital. Now let's follow the money because, well, funding always shapes art, doesn't it? And we start with the Scottish Arts Council, the SAC. Sources suggest it had some fundamental problems right from the start.
It really did. The SAC was supposed to operate at arm's length from government. That was the principle.
Independent decision-making.
Theoretically. It was set up as a subcommittee of the Arts Council of Great Britain, the ACGB. The whole idea was to minimize direct political meddling. But in reality, both that arm's length idea and the principle of funding based on needs response, well, they kind of fell apart when it came to homegrown Scottish political theater.
Why? What was the flaw in the system, if it aimed for impartiality?
Well, fundamentally, it wasn't democratic. There was no real public accountability. The selection process for who sat on the SAC boards and advisory panels wasn't robust or democratic. So what happened?
Who ended up in charge?
It tended to attract people from, highly educated upper and middle class backgrounds. And these appointees often develop a kind of cultural elitism.
The sources use this striking term, cultural evil use, almost like a colonial term. What does that imply here?
It's a loaded term, yeah. It suggests people who've sort of evolved by adopting the tastes and values of the dominant power, in this case, the perceived high culture associated more with London or international standards.
So they were skeptical of purely Scottish work.
Often, yes. Especially work rooted in popular or working class experience. They tended to see Scottishness in art as potentially parochial, maybe a bit narrow, even embarrassing. They much preferred what they saw as the universalism of high art.
Like opera, ballet.
Exactly. Opera, classical ballet, maybe big plays that had been successful in London. They valued that over theater, directly addressing, say, contemporary life for working class Scots.
So the very people meant to nurture Scottish arts had a bias against certain kinds of Scottish art. And this directly impacted funding in the 80s.
Absolutely. The structure itself disadvantaged political theater. If you look at the bigger picture, the established high art companies' opera, for instance, they tended to get consistent deficit funding, often topped up with extra cash injections throughout the 80s.
But they were protected.
Largely, yes. This top-down hierarchical funding model meant the cultural elite could mostly avoid the harsh market realities Thatcherism was imposing elsewhere. But politically committed theater, popular theater aiming for working-class audiences, that was seen as niche, or worse, as too political.
And therefore didn't fit the universal high art mold.
Precisely. So it struggled to get consistent, reliable funding from the SAC. It's a real paradox, isn't it? The theater that was arguably most relevant to the social and political moment was the hardest to fund through the official channels.
But that difficulty, that gap in funding, it created an opening. didn't it, for local authorities?
It did. They became absolutely crucial, a lifeline.
Was it just about the money, or was their approach different?
Oh, the philosophy was completely different. Local authority funding, mostly coming from labor-run councils like Glasgow District Council, specifically grew to fill that gap left by the SAC, and this funding was openly sympathetic to community arts, to political theater.
They valued it differently.
They valued it. They recognized the importance of companies like Borderline, Fablevision, Wildcat, 7.84. So it created this alternative funding stream, ideologically aligned with the work, that completely bypassed the SAC's sort of elitist judgment.
And this had real, tangible results in terms of buildings, infrastructure.
Yes, very visible results. And it went against the grain of what was happening elsewhere in the UK at the time.
How so?
Well, take Wildcat Theatre's Clyde Theatre in Clydebank. That was set up and run with direct support from the district council. Meanwhile, in England, big established companies, the Royal Shakespeare Company, Bristol Old Vic, they were facing huge funding cuts, threats of closure.
But in Scotland, new venues were opening.
Supported locally, yes. New venues dedicated to precisely this kind of popular political work. It really shows the impact of local political will when it aligns with cultural need.
And you can even see this split funding dynamic playing out in big national events, like Glasgow being the European City of Culture in 1990.
Glasgow 1990 is a perfect example. Its success, its comprehensiveness, was really down to having these two parallel approaches. You had the official, high art-focused program, championed by bodies like the Scottish Regional Council, SRC, which tended to favor short-term, professional, high-cost events.
The usual suspects.
Kind of. But alongside that, you had the local authority, Glasgow District Council, GDC, driving a complementary program focused on participation, non-professional arts, community engagement, stuff designed to leave a longer-term legacy.
So even though most of the cash probably went to the big stuff.
Oh, undoubtedly. The funding was still skewed towards the high art professional side, but having that dual strategy meant a much broader range of people got involved, both as audience members and as actual creators. It proved that local engagement could thrive, even if the top-level funding body wasn't fully on board.
Okay, let's dive into the actual theater now. And Wildcat is such a key example, emerging from 7.84 Scotland. Their strategy for reaching a working-class audience seems really deliberate.
Oh, it was incredibly smart, very pragmatic. Wildcat understood right from the start that if you want to reach working-class communities, you have to be entertaining, you have to be accessible, and crucially, you have to be affordable.
So what forms did they use?
They leaned heavily into popular forms. Rock operas, cabaret-style shows, things with music, energy, direct appeal, and they were absolutely rigorous about keeping ticket prices low.
That's key, isn't it?
Vital. They recognized the economic reality for their target audience. That cheap ticket policy built sustained support, real loyalty within working-class communities. They were definitely political, polemical even, but they knew that the politics wouldn't land if nobody was in the room to hear it.
And a great example of that style is their 1982 show, 1982, which later became Any Minute Now, about the nuclear arms race.
Yes, Any Minute Now is a fantastic case study, a masterclass, really, in blending politics and popular entertainment. They use the format of a courtroom trial.
Which is naturally dramatic.
Inherently dramatic, exactly. And they didn't just let the audience watch passively, they explicitly cast the audience as the jury.
So involving them directly.
Directly. The performers would literally address them, tell them, you make your own mind up, you use your discrimination. The central dilemma wasn't about the facts. Everyone knew the defendant, Mary McKinley, had killed her child to supposedly save him from nuclear war. The question was why?
Temporary insanity driven by fear versus cold-blooded murder.
Exactly. That was the conflict the jury, the audience had to resolve.
But the trial format suggests balance, fairness. The sources argue, though, that the show was actually heavily biased towards the anti-nuclear side. How did they achieve that?
Through emotional weight, really.
Yeah.
And character focus. Mary McKinley, the mother, she was given far more psychological depth, more backstory than anyone else. Her fear, her motivations were made understandable, relatable, even sympathetic.
And the casting mattered, too.
Hugely. She was played by Terry Neeson, who is apparently just phenomenal, a performer with incredible charisma, a thrilling voice, huge stage presence. She became the audience's emotional anchor.
So you identify with her.
You identify with her. And that powerful emotional connection just kind of erodes any sense of objective balance the trial format might imply.
And the actual evidence presented in the trial was skewed too.
Oh, completely. During the defense's case, they presented this chilling factual list of all the military bases across Scotland, U.S. bases, nuclear weapons sites, the works,
Grounding her fear in reality.
making it absolutely clear her fears weren't just paranoia. They were based on the stark geopolitical reality of Scotland at the time. And they reinforced this visually, projecting a map showing just how saturated the country was with these military installations.
And the prosecution's case.
It was undermined. Their main argument was there are no little murders. That killing is killing, regardless of motive. But the performance itself kind of glossed over the actual physical horror of the child's death. The emotional force of the whole production was marshaled almost entirely behind the anti-nuclear, anti-state argument.
Wildcat clearly hit a nerve. They had huge success, didn't they? Big sponsorships from unions, for instance.
Massive support. Trade unions were crucial. They got £21,000 in sponsorship for On the Pig's Back, which tackled NHS cuts. And they were right there on the front lines during the miners' strike with a show called Dead Liberty, real activist theater.
But then, later in the 80s, there's this criticism that they started going soft. What happened?
Well, the type of show seemed to shift. They started doing more work that was purely celebratory of working class culture, often quite nostalgic.
Like the steamy.
The Steamy is the absolute prime example. Set in a Glasgow washhouse in the 50s, hugely popular, became a Scottish institution. But also things like Waiting on One, set in a bingo hall, or the Celtic Story for the football club centenary.
So less overtly political.
Less overtly polemical, certainly. And the criticism was that they were producing these, quote, anodyne versions of working class life. Sanitized, maybe sentimental depictions, designed primarily to pull in huge crowds and guarantee box office success.
Even their later campaigning shows were maybe lighter.
Yeah, shows like Cleaning Up, which was about local government tendering. Actually, they used that successful, lighter style established by the Steamy, lots of humor, a cappella singing, very entertaining, but maybe less confrontational than the earlier work.
So this brings us right back to that core dilemma for political theater, doesn't it?
Yeah.
How do you stay radical, stay challenging, but also reach a big audience? Did Wildcat compromise their mission?
It's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The sources suggest it's complex. David McLennan, one of the key figures in Wildcat, he seemed comfortable with this shift. He talked about regenerating working-class culture, celebrating it, and didn't necessarily see a rigid line between political and other kinds of theater.
So for them, entertainment was the politics.
In a way, yes. The argument is that their very success as polemicists was, and I quote, crucially linked to the very things that made it good entertainment. They prioritized reaching people, engaging them, giving them a good night out. You could argue that making populism work was their unique political achievement.
Okay, so Wildcat found success through popular forms, rock opera, cabaret. But that wasn't the only way Scottish political theater operated, was it? Other companies were experimenting with much more, well, theoretical, anti-realist forms.
Absolutely. You have companies pushing the boundaries formally, often drawing inspiration from European avant-garde figures like Brecht or Grotowski, trying to find different ways to convey complex political ideas.
And Theatre PKF's The Bruise from 1982 is a key example here.
Yes, The Bruise. Their whole style was deliberately minimalist, a kind of workshop-type theater.
What did that look like in practice?
Very stripped back. Minimal props. The stage lighting often wasn't dimmed between scenes. Actors might even work openly with scripts in hand. It was a conscious rejection of, the illusionism, the expensive sets and costumes of traditional bourgeois theater.
Was that purely an artistic choice, or was it also about, well, just not having much money?
It seems like a fascinating mix of both, actually. It definitely reflected their artistic principles, influenced by Brecht's ideas about breaking the illusion, making the audience think rather than just feel, and Grotowski's focus on the actor and minimal resources.
The poor theater idea.
Exactly. But let's be honest, it also reflected the reality of their situation. They were operating on a shoestring. They effectively turned that lack of resources into an aesthetic statement, signaling to the audience. This isn't about passive entertainment. It's about active intellectual engagement.
And the play itself, The Bruise, took on this huge figure from Scottish history, Robert the Bruce, but not in the usual heroic way.
Not at all. It completely challenged the romantic myth of Bruce as the great unifying warrior king. Instead, he's presented as this really complex figure, partly a self-serving, ambitious nobleman, partly a leader of the people. Ambiguous.
So not the straightforward hero.
Definitely not. And the play does something really interesting ideologically. It shifts the heroic mantle, the real hope for a free Scotland, away from Bruce and onto William Wallace. Wallace is depicted as the more authentic, uncompromising leader of the ordinary people, the sma folk.
How did they get that complexity across to the audience structurally? It sounds like it could be quite confusing.
They used what the sources call a dialectical structure. It was about constantly shifting the audience's viewpoint by deliberately juxtaposing scenes from very different worlds. You'd have a scene with the nobles, full of high politics and intrigue, immediately followed by a scene with the ordinary peasants, the small folk, dealing with the everyday consequences of those high politics.
Creating deliberate clashes.
Exactly. Deliberate incongruities. It forces the audience to make connections, to bridge the gaps, to actively piece together the meaning, rather than just passively receiving it.
Can you give an example of that kind of jump?
Sure. The play apparently opened with this grand magisterial speech by King Edward I of England, very formal, high rhetoric. And then, bam, the next scene cuts to two peasants just having a normal conversational chat while they happen to be carrying the stone of scone under their arm.
Okay, yeah, that's quite a jolt.
It jolts you out of simply identifying emotionally with one world or the other. It forces you to see these competing realities side by side and think about the relationship between them.
And very much in the Brechtian tradition, they actually built in a way for the audience to process this.
Yes, a key part of the event was the post-performance discussion. This wasn't just an optional extra, it was integral. The idea was to encourage the audience to, quote, seize for itself economy in its judgment, to grapple openly with the play's contradictions and ambiguities right there in the room.
Empowering the audience.
That was the goal. Although the source material does raise an interesting point that experienced theatergoers might quickly get used to these techniques, see the devices, without necessarily engaging with the deeper ideological implications. The form itself can become just another convention if you're not careful.
Right. Now, let's shift gears a bit from that kind of high theory epic theater to something quite different formally, but equally challenging politically. Clyde Unity's Killing Me Softly in 1987.
Yes, a really significant play because it tackled homosexuality and the AIDS crisis, which was hugely sensitive, especially for a working-class audience at that time.
And largely ignored on stage.
Very rarely addressed, certainly not in a way that tried to move beyond, negative stereotypes or just easy laughs from comic campness.
Telling me.
Softly, aimed for something more serious, more human.
But interestingly, its form was quite different from the Bruce. More traditional.
Much more traditional, yes. It used a classic realist structure. It had a central love story motif, relied quite heavily on sentimentality, and even used that famous Roberta Flack song, Killing Me Softly, as a recurring emotional theme.
So the tension here seems to be between the radical, difficult subject matter and the more conventional, accessible form.
Exactly, and particularly in how the central character, Tim, is presented. He's a young, gay student, he's HIV positive, but the way he's written is very specific.
Oh, so?
He's portrayed as very passive, quite insecure, lacking confidence. He explicitly shies away from sexual intimacy throughout the play. His defining trait, really, is his vulnerability, his self-consciousness.
And that's how the audience is meant to connect with him. Through pity, almost.
Largely, yes. His vulnerability is the main route for audience sympathy. And politically, this portrayal did achieve something important. It countered the homophobic stereotype of gay men as predatory or promiscuous. It showed vulnerability, fear.
But there's a but, isn't there? Did that sympathetic portrayal come at a cost? Did it maybe avoid the harder political questions?
That's the critique raised in the sources, yes. By presenting this very specific, almost desexualized version of a gay man, Tim isn't shown in a fulfilling sexual relationship based on his orientation, and he's ultimately contained within a sympathetic family structure. Did the play sidestep the more challenging aspects of gay life? The very things, perhaps, that actually fuel real-world homophobia.
So it offered a syncopated version, as the source puts it.
Exactly. A version made acceptable, perhaps palatable for a potentially wary audience, but maybe at the expense of a fuller, more confrontational political engagement with the realities of gay experience and prejudice. It succeeded in being accessible, but maybe pulled its punches politically.
Okay, so we've traced this fascinating path, the struggle with funding, the tension between populism and polemics and Wildcat, the formal experiments of PKF and Clyde Unity. We saw how even a company like 7.84 eventually hit the rocks, partly due to that dependence on funding. Now we jump forward quite a bit to Bloodwater Theatre, BWT. They seem to emerge with a much more theoretical approach, trying to tackle the process of making theater itself.
Yes. BWT, founded much later, in 2011. They started from a place of analyzing why previous left-wing or collaborative theater groups sometimes failed or ended up replicating the very structures they opposed.
What did they identify as the problem?
They recognized that even in groups aiming for equality, the practicalities of making theater often led back to hierarchical models. Efficiency, utility taking over, directors directing, writers writing. The usual divisions of labor that mirror capitalist production.
Even in radical companies.
Even there. So BWT's mission was incredibly radical, to actually reclaim shared ownership in collaborative theater making. Not just talk about it, but experiment practically with ways to achieve genuine equality and shared ownership in the room.
And they developed a specific framework for this, DCT.
Dialectical Collaborative Theatre, yes, DCT. It's a really rigorous model, deeply rooted in Marxist ideas, actually. It encourages the makers to constantly analyze the process through 3 interconnected phases.
Okay, what are these phases?
They are the theater work as a commodity, its relationship to the means of production, and its function as pedagogy.
Right, let's break those down. Commodity.
Recognizing that ultimately the play will be presented, consumed, possibly sold. It exists in a market, even if you resist that.
Means of production.
That refers to everything used to make it the rehearsal space, the actor's skills and bodies, the scripts, the technology. Who controls those?
And pedagogy.
This is maybe the most crucial. It sees the process of making the theater, the collaboration itself, as a learning process. A way of teaching and learning alternative ways of working together for both the creators and potentially the audience.
So the politics isn't just in the play's message, it's in how the play is made.
Exactly. The structure is the politics. And to make this real, BWT operated in explicitly non-hierarchical ways. For major works like Whose Story Is It Anyway? Or Leave Your Shoes at the Door, there was no single designated director or writer.
Wow. How did that actually work? How do they avoid the default hierarchies, the usual power dynamics creeping back in?
They used this really interesting, almost theatrical technique themselves. They adopted alter egos.
Alter egos, like personas.
Yes. The core members created and consistently used specific personas' names, like Fatima, Monica, Lucy, Gordon. These were developed within a fictional framework, like an imaginary artistic residency.
What was the point of that?
It functioned as a kind of defense mechanism, as they put it. It allowed the individuals to consciously step away from their real-world professional identities, their egos, their status, their previous industry experience.
So Fatima's idea wasn't judged based on the actor playing Fatima's CV.
Precisely. It helped level the playing field in the rehearsal room, ensuring ideas were considered on their own merit, regardless of who voiced them. It was a practical tool for dismantling those ingrained professional hierarchies.
That's fascinating. And this commitment ran so deep that they kept working even when funding dried up, which must have forced them to think about value differently.
Absolutely. This brings us right back to Marxist value theory, which is clearly underpinning their whole approach. Marx distinguishes between use value and exchange value.
Okay, refresh us quickly. Use value is?
Use value is qualitative. It's about the usefulness of something, the intrinsic satisfaction you get from it, the personal or social benefit. Creating art, the collective process, the learning that has use value.
And exchange value.
That's quantitative. It's the price tag, how much money it's worth in the market, its relationship to other commodities.
So BWT consciously prioritized use value.
They had to, especially when funding failed. They prioritized the qualitative rewards, the satisfaction of collective creation, the artistic exploration, the personal development, the ethical integrity of how they were working together. The remuneration, the exchange value became secondary.
They were essentially saying the process was the primary product, and its value wasn't dependent on external validation or cash.
Exactly. And their willingness to do this work in their leisure time, effectively donating their labor power, was itself a political act. It was a rejection of the capitalist division between work, paid, and life, unpaid. Their continued existence, often unfunded, became a testament to the idea that they owned their process and its intrinsic value, regardless of the market. It was an attempt to model a different, non-capitalist relationship to making art.
And they even extended this idea of ownership and ethical engagement to the audience, didn't they? With their ethical ticket idea.
Yes, for their 2014 show, Leave Your Shoes at the Door, they did something really innovative with ticketing. They offered a flexible price scale. 10, £2, £7, £8, or £10. You chose what to pay.
Not just a concession price, but a genuine choice.
A genuine choice. And it wasn't just about making it affordable, although that was part of it. It was explicitly designed to open up a conversation with the audience about value, commodification, and the ethics of consuming art.
How did audiences react to being put on the spot like that?
The feedback they gathered was amazing. People didn't just automatically go for the free or cheapest option. They really thought about it.
What factors did they consider?
All sorts. They talked about the potential quality they expected, their own personal affordability, of course, but also the value they placed on the artist's labor and their own personal ethics around supporting independent, non-mainstream work.
So the act of buying a ticket became part of the engagement.
Absolutely. It blurred those traditional lines. The audience member wasn't just a passive consumer buying a fixed-price product. They became an active participant in negotiating the value of the experience, extending that BWT principle of shared ownership right out into the auditorium. #outro.
Wow. So reflecting on all this, we've really charted a course through decades of struggle, innovation, and adaptation in Scottish political theatre. It's this constant, energetic battle, isn't it? Fighting against that central funding bias, figuring out how to reach a popular working-class audience without, watering things down too much.
That tension between the anodyne and the effective. Exactly.
Yeah.
And then the incredible variety of forms used to get the message across, from Wildcat's rock operas to the really challenging anti-realism of PKF, and then all the way to Bloodwater Theatre, fundamentally questioning the entire production model.
And it does leave you with a really important question, I think. You see companies like 7.84, hugely influential, eventually getting caught in the web of funding demands, the pressures of the capitalist system they were critiquing.
Yeah.
But then BWT comes along and tries a completely different tack. They consciously reject the idea of the single artistic genius. They deprioritize the profit motive and focus intensely on the ethics of the process.
How the work gets made becomes the message.
You could argue that, yes. Their practice suggests that maybe the most profoundly political thing about theater isn't just the story it tells, the anti-nuclear stance, the poll tax protest, but the way it tells it, the mechanism of creation. That collaborative, non-hierarchical act trying to live out your politics in the rehearsal room, maybe that is the most radical statement of all. So thinking about this for you, the listener, what's the takeaway here? It seems it's about looking beyond just the surface, beyond the script or the stage picture.
Definitely. If you want to understand the political in art, you have to ask those deeper questions. Who's actually holding the power in this process? Who's getting the funding and why? How is power being shared or maybe not shared among the creators?
It forces you, doesn't it, to be a more critical consumer or maybe participant in culture. To ask yourself, when I watch this play or engage with this art, am I just consuming a finished product handed down from on high?
Or are you witnessing something more, perhaps even participating in a process that's trying in its own way to be revolutionary? That's the question BWT and this whole history really leaves us with.